Well, hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and today we're going to be talking about hose. Because these things are very important but oft overlooked maintenance items. We are talking specifically about coolant hose today. By the end of this video, we will have replaced every single coolant line on my 1992 Acura NSX back here. I'm going to cover why I'm doing so, why it's important, where one can easily find all of the hoses for your NSX without having to think too hard about it. I'll cover the general procedure of removing and replacing the hoses, as well as cover a few tips, tricks, and helpful tools in case you decide to tackle the job yourself. First things first, why am I actually going through the trouble of replacing every single coolant hose on the car? Well, I've had my NSX for around 12 years now, and early on I did replace all of the hoses, but the youngest replacement hose on here is probably 10 years and 70,000 miles old at this point, and that's as far as I'm willing to push it given my usage case. And when it comes to coolant hoses, I have some checkered past with mid-engine cars and coolant problems. So this is one place where ain't broke, don't fix certainly does not apply. Rubber ages more than it wears in a hose type application, and coolant hoses are easy things to overlook in your maintenance schedule, at least until they start leaking. Now, depending on when and how that leak happens, the results could range from inconvenience to catastrophe. Personally, I don't really want to be stuck on the side of the road, ruin an engine by warping a head from an overheat, or dump a bunch of antifreeze on a racetrack going into a fast turn. Then it becomes somebody else's problem, and I really do not want to be that guy. So, I am being proactive and preemptive with this replacement. I will say, if you have a garage queen and or live in a particularly dry climate, you may actually consider doing this service more often, because in those cases a lack of use can actually be worse than a lot of use. Now, procuring the replacement hoses, at least for an NSX, is as easy as dropping a line to SOS Speed out in Arizona. They actually sell kits that have all of the hoses in them, so you're not having to dig for part numbers and things like that. Before you go taking things apart, I would recommend calling them and to confirm stock. At least in my case, there were a couple of the smaller hoses that were on back order. Again, in my case, it was just a short delay, but it is something to keep in mind. The kit they sell at the current time retails for around $450, give or take, depending on the year of your car and specific options. The automatic versus manual transmission, for instance. I always appreciate the extra touches when I get things from SOS Speed, like this handy diagram, so you can both validate what you received and figure out where it all goes. Getting to the actual work of replacing all of the coolant hoses, before I drain or disassemble anything, I want to make completely sure that I have everything I need to do the job. To do so, I unpacked and laid out all of the coolant hoses in their relative respective positions along the car, and then went through and took inventory. There are 6 hoses in the front, 3 in the middle, and 14 in the engine bay, for a grand total of 23 coolant hoses on an early generation NSX. So a couple of days later, but with everything accounted for, it was now time to take the next step, which was to drain the coolant. First, turn the ignition to at least the accessory position, move the climate control to max temperature, and wait a few seconds. This will open the heater valve so that the coolant in the heater loop will drain without any added steps. Now remove the plastic belly pan covering the center tunnel, position a large drain pan expecting plural gallons of antifreeze, and undo the 2 drain bolts from the center pipes. Once draining is underway, I recommend opening the expansion tank and removing the bleed plug from the top of the radiator to hasten things along. Once the center drains have slowed, loosen the drain cock at the bottom of the radiator. If you have a stock radiator and no debris in the way, it should drain through this hole in the support without much mess. Finally, there are drains in the front and back of the engine block. In my car, the front drain had a clear path to the catch pan, while in the rear some tubing helped avoid a mess. With the coolant now drained, and in my case a new radiator installed, let's now take a look at some of the highlights and challenges of changing out the hoses themselves. In particular, uninstalling old coolant hoses can be a serious pain in the, well, primarily your fingers, occasionally the palm of your hand, and sometimes an eyeball if you don't gracefully remove these spring clamps and keep a hold of them. So what I have laid out here on the table in front is a kind of an assortment of tools that may make the job a little bit easier, at least with dealing with the hoses themselves, or at least tolerable. So first, of course, we have our diagrams up here to make sure that we have all the parts we need, then some basic hand and eye protection, because you're going to be, applying some clamping force to things pretty good, and it can just, it'll put indentations on your hand pretty quickly. And then your goggles to make sure you don't eat one of these things in the wrong places. A little bit of, this is silicone grease. Alternately, you can use non-petroleum based dish soap that's for reinstallation. Again, for install and reinstall, got a couple of, or removal and reinstall, a couple of different sizes and lengths of needle nose plier, slightly larger set of adjustable pliers. We'll cover that, and then the razor knife up here. We'll cover the twist and the slit style of removing a really stubborn old hose as we get into the job itself. And then finally over here, if you are a tool aficionado and or have larger hands, this is a dedicated set of hose clamp pliers. I'll show you how those work here in a little bit. That tubing up there, that's just from draining the coolant out of the rear bank on the NSX. Now, NSX-Specifics, there are 4 sizes of these spring type hose clamps that you're going to see on the NSX. They are in order from largest to smallest: 40.7 millimeters, 21.7 millimeters, 18.7 millimeters, and finally 12.5 millimeters. Because our if you aren't used to having a Japanese car with an extremely detailed shop manual, that may be a foreign concept to you to have a specific down to the 1/10 of a millimeter measurement for your hose clamps, but we are blessed with such with the NSX, so there we go. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, why would I reuse these? I can do all of that with a worm drive clamp. Well, no, you can't. Get rid of those things. They are terrible. They have all of the faults and none of the benefits of any other hose clamp, really, especially for smaller diameters. The spring drive clamp, or the spring type clamps like this, they can grow and shrink with the hose as it gets hot and cold, or old for that matter. They maintain a constant pressure all the way around the diameter, and they don't leave a flat spot. The worm drive clamps, where you have the actual, now that I've thrown it off the table, of course, can't show you this, but where the actual worm drive mechanism is, especially on the smaller diameters of hose clamp, that's going to leave a flat spot that can lead to leaks. I've actually experienced that myself. So I'm going to be very careful to go through and reuse everywhere that I can. And if I can't reuse one of these things, I'm either going to get a new one from Acura if possible. If not, then I think I can source measurements. These things, I have obviously I have them in front of me so I can measure them all for the stock thickness as well as the diameter to replace them. But that's the short version of what you're going to need. I don't know of anything else that would come in too terrible handy. But yeah, so now that you kind of have an idea of what it's going to take, what we're going to need to do this job, let's go and get to it. A quick note on hose removal. The old hoses almost 100% will be stuck to the pipes. There are 2 ways to dislodge them gracefully. First, I typically try to twist them loose. With some aggressively jawed pliers, grip the hose with enough force to get purchase on the rubber, but not enough force to deform the pipe. Twist back and forth a few times and you'll likely hear some faint crunching, and then the hose should begin to freely rotate. You should then be able to wiggle it off. If that doesn't work, or the hose end is inaccessible to your pliers, then you can very carefully slit the hose lengthwise where it overlaps the pipe. I usually make several light passes with a sharp razor knife, emphasis on light passes. Your one job here is to not gouge or score the soft aluminum and or brass pipe, because that can lead to leaks. Starting at the front of the car, I've already done all the hoses in this compartment while I was putting in the radiator. Things you do want to consider up here, or kind of some tips I would have, is you will need to remove the battery to get to the bottom end of this hose. This is the one that comes from the heater valve and goes underneath the car to the center tunnel. Because the connection for it is directly above the steering rack, you might be able to get to it from underneath the car, but it's easy enough to just remove the battery and reach underneath. The other thing with the heater valve, which is this piece right here, this little block right here, it is kind of pegged onto the blower motor housing, which can make installing it kind of difficult when you're going back in with it. I found that it was easiest to install the rear hose. So there's a hose that connects this to the actual heater core that penetrates the bulkhead right here. It's easiest to first attach the hose to the heater valve itself, put both hose clamps on that side, and then push that hose with the heater valve on it onto the barb for the heater core. Otherwise, if you put the hose on first and then try and install the heater core or the heater valve afterwards, it makes getting it back on these pegs very difficult. I remember that from the first time I replaced that, so I didn't make the mistake again. Speaking of making mistakes again, when you are putting hose clamps on, do be mindful of their orientation. You know, me being a righty, it's easy to reach in here and grab this one like this. The one that's back on the bulkhead attached to the outlet or inlet barb for this this connection to the heater core is also kind of that direction, so I could reach in there with a long pair of pliers, pinch it and pull straight out. If you have them cocked around some other different way, it can make, when you have your NSX for a decade and have to do this more than once, think of your future self when you're reinstalling things. Last point up front here, this piece here, this pipe, this changed at some point in time. If you have an early production car, early production NA1, 91, 92, this will up here, this will just have a barb on it with a rubber cap clamped around it. And it is a pain in the butt when you go to bleed the car to deal with just an open hose barb. So if possible, I would recommend updating this part. If you're in there anyway and you have everything apart as it is, the part number stamped on there, 7974 Bravo-SL0-A001. That is the updated part number that actually has a threaded valve on it up here, which is way easier to deal with. You just, put a little, whatever that is, 1/4 inch tubing on there and put it in a container, and then you just crack it open and you might end up with a little bit of drippage, but nowhere near the amount that you're going to get with just the open barb. So having I think that's all the tips and tricks here. Everything else is literally just, undo hose clamp, pry hose off, shove hose back on, replace hose clamp. Just remember to put the hose clamps on the hose before you put the hose on the barb, or you'll end up redoing things. So moving on though, to the middle of the car where we find 3 of these sneakier hoses on the NSX. I only say sneaky because under normal operation they're covered up by a belly pan, and so if there is a small leak or any issue with them, you may not notice it immediately because they're not right in front of you, as would be, say, the radiator hoses. These 3 hoses are fairly simple with respect to removal and reinstallation because they are straight. They're a little bit difficult to access from a hose clamp standpoint, so you're going to want to pay particular attention to kind of order of operations as you're reinstalling them and clamp orientation to make sure you don't have any situation that you could create some abrasion with a hose clamp rubbing on one of the other hoses, as was the case here. Now I've only had one hose on the NSX burst on me, and it was one of these 3. Fortunately, that happened within coasting distance of a shop that I was friendly with at the time, so I essentially rolled into their lot and asked them if they could help and work me in the next day or 2, and they were able to do so. Unfortunately, it appears they used the aforementioned worm drive clamps to install the new hoses, new at the time hoses, 10 or 11 years ago. And that probably is part of the reason that this one seems to have had kind of a slow seep over the years. I don't know if you can tell this on the video, but it is distinctly coming from where the flat part, where the worm drive apparatus is on the clamp. So I will be replacing that with a new spring type clamp and hopefully not have a repeat of this situation. The only thing you do want to be careful of with installation on these three is that you have full engagement of the hose ends over the pipe barbs on both ends evenly, and also making sure you're able to get full clamp coverage behind the barb, such as it is. Finally, moving to the rear of the car, there are two main areas in which you'll be working. The bulk of the hoses numerically that you're going to deal with are going to be on the left side, in the area around the water inlet, thermostat, and throttle body. On the right side of the car, there are also just a pair of hoses coming off of the oil cooler above the oil filter pedestal. These are few in number, but probably the hardest hoses to get to on the car. More on that in a moment. Moving back to the left side of the car for a moment, getting to these hoses can be a bit tricky. There are two main approaches, I would call them. One of them involves significantly more swearing and probably some bleeding, and the other involves disassembling a few extra things. From looking at the engine compartment, the astute among you will note that I have elected to remove the air box entirely, the expansion tank, which you are going to need to disconnect from its hoses anyway, and the throttle body. Now, some of you will note that this is not a stock expansion tank. It is not. It came from the now defunct Dolly Racing. I guess I probably shouldn't say that out loud around the NSX community, but it has treated me well, so credit where due. I don't know if I can recommend taking quite the same approach on the right side of the car with the oil filter pedestal hoses, but you will have to dismount the oil filter pedestal and oil cooler from the engine block. We'll get to that, some detail on that here in a moment. I actually paused my reinstallation of the drive shaft on this side simply because it made getting access to those, I guess the second of the two hoses there, significantly easier without the drive shaft and heat shield in the way. At the very least, you'll need to remove the heat shield that goes around that drive shaft, or the inner CV joint rather, to get a little bit better access to this hose in particular. So as I said, you'll need to dismount the oil filter pedestal and oil cooler assembly in order to, really it's more in order to get the new hoses onto it. Obviously you could cut the old hoses off, but I'm not sure you could actually affix the new hoses without risking damage to one of the pipes, or one or more of the pipes, I should say. While you're in there, and this actually comes with the kit that SOS provides, you'll need to replace the, or you'll probably want to replace the double O-ring that goes in this little cavity here. All right, this little guy. And SOS does include it, one of these with the kit that you buy from them. The quote-unquote all the hoses also includes this one double O-ring, because you will need it to actually complete the job gracefully and ensure you don't end up with an oil leak. The other part of this involves the bolts. Right, the bolts. The shop manual, as well as the NSX brain trust at large, I'll call them, all suggest coating the top two bolts on the oil filter pedestal with Honda Bond before reinstallation. Having said that, there is some debate on the internet. These bolts are labeled special bolts in the manual, and my research suggests they originally came with some kind of shmoo molded into the threads. Now, the debate is whether that is thread locker or an actual sealant, like Honda Bond is kind of a gasket maker type compound. So there is some debate there. I don't know which is in literal terms correct. However, I do know that a lot of people, or rather known experts who have done a lot of this type of maintenance on numerous NSXs, and without having any issues or catastrophe, say to use Honda Bond, so that's the direction I was leaning. If you are inexplicably an engineer that worked on the original NSX and you know definitively the answer to that question, please leave it in the comments below. We would all benefit from your knowledge. And or if anybody related to that, if anybody wants to help me subtitle my videos in Japanese so we can kind of get some across the Pacific conversation going on there, that would be much obliged. But Unrelated to that, I think that is where we're going to leave it for today. I'm going to go and get on with actually finishing the hose replacement, getting the axle reinstalled and things like that. The next thing you will see then will be a video covering refilling and bleeding the coolant system on the NSX, which is a distinctly non-trivial operation. It's probably one of the, no matter what you do, if you've drained the coolant, getting the coolant back in the car, full up and not having any bubbles that could cause you kind of false overheating instances and things like that, or real overheating if it's bad enough. That can be a very tricky proposition. I will walk you through the process as well as show you a tool or two that can help you both get to the point of the final small bleed much quicker, and then also check your work afterwards. So look forward to that. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video or learned something from it or got something out of it, or even just got motivation to go and do something yourself on your NSX, please leave a like. If I have missed something, you guys are awesome at this. If I have missed something, leave it in the comments down below. Again, we'll all benefit from that knowledge going forward, and I can, even myself, if I'll publish this video on a Tuesday, and if I'm not done with this, I have the opportunity to go back and fix a divot potentially. So there is that. And if you'd like to see more of this type of thing on the channel, or if you own an NSX yourself and kind of want to follow along with somebody who's likely to break things before you do, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click the bell, and that way you'll get a notification anytime I manage to get myself into some situation like this where I now have to reassemble a car in order to go and do the things that I really want to do. So anyhow, you guys are all heroes if you made it this far. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and I will see you all in the next video, if not at the track.